For us, it is by teaching the church again and again that the numerical growth of the church is not on us. We have to have a clarity as what are we called to, and it's to be faithful to proclaiming the whole gospel. Most of the people who are part of our church, one of the biggest learning curve for most of them was to actually get a better grip of the gospel. Shocking how often you will encounter people who have been in church for 5 years, 10 years, and yet they have a very difficult time articulating the gospel. So as a church, we made it a priority that we want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding as what the gospel is. By teaching that again and again, that's how we try to fight some of that pressure, and by reminding people that our calling is to be faithful.
Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Engagement with ABWE. I'm joined as always by my good buddy and co-host, Scott W. Dunford, who joins us from the West Coast. He is pastor of Western Hills Church in San Mateo. He's also back on Twitter, which I know maybe 10% of you care about.
I'm already regretting
my heart.
Yeah.
It warms my heart to have him back in the fray. And we are joined in the fray, speaking of, by a live in-studio guest. Well, live for us, pre-recorded for all of you. Hate to give away that company secret. This is not a live podcast, but we are joined nevertheless by good friend Mihai Chisari, who is a pastor in Moldova. Where in Moldova?
Chisinau, capital city. Yeah.
Okay. And also a partner with ABWE. Through Live Global, which is the wing of our ministry that focuses on partnering directly with nationally based ministries. And it's so good to have you in the studio here today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah.
It's an honor.
And, there's so many things happening in that part of the world.
Yeah.
If our listeners aren't familiar with Moldova and why it matters and what it's like doing ministry in the shadow of such things as the former Soviet Union and all of the impact of that culturally, there's also the fact of everything that's been happening in Ukraine there over the last several years. And we want to speak to that. We're actually going to save that for our overtime segment. And so that'll be recorded. That'll be available in our membership portal for our premium members. If you are not a premium member, why not join at $9.99 a month? You can get access to our bonus episodes, our overtime show, exclusive live streams that we do, including our most recent one with our friend Ethan Holden, dispelling and debating some popular myths about missions and also discussing some hot takes against the modern missions movement. We recorded that one recently there. Our private signal thread and more, all of that for partners of the show. And so we invite you to participate in that. But enough of those housekeeping items. Mihai, I do want to turn the floor over to you and give you a chance to let us know, who are you? Tell us a little bit about your ministry and also how you came to partner with ABWE, which powers the Missions Podcast.
Yeah. Mihai Chisari. Sometimes some people would have difficulties with pronouncing my name, so that English version of it would be Michael. Born and raised in Republic of Moldova, which is Eastern Europe. Born and raised in Eastern Orthodox family, which is common for 96% of Moldovans. Mm-hmm. That's what pretty much being a Moldovan means, is part of the national identity. You are an Eastern Orthodox. God saved me in somewhat interesting circumstances, as my mom would encourage me to visit the small Baptist church in the village where I was growing up with my grandparents. Nobody in my extended family was a believer, and she would not go to church. But she was abroad, and she was concerned perhaps for how it would be raised. And she would encourage me to visit the church there. I was exposed to the gospel. And
now, when you say, I'm sorry to interrupt, when you say she wasn't a believer, not even in Eastern Orthodoxy. It
is difficult with Eastern Orthodoxy, to say that somebody is a believer, because the gospel as we know it, is not preached, and salvation is not by justification and through faith in Christ alone. You add a lot of extra stuff to that. So she would be disappointed with Eastern Orthodox at this time when she would encourage me to visit the church, because she'd been in a house where people would call themselves Eastern Orthodox, but there will be a lot of alcohol abuse, and she kind of gave up on the idea that Eastern Orthodox is actually something authentic. But while in that small Baptist church in a village, I was under the preaching of the gospel, and by God's grace, I got saved at about the age of 17. After that, all I knew that I wanted to do is to be in ministry, perhaps because of the heavy influence of my pastor. He is the one who spent a lot of time with me. He's the one who mentored me a lot, and he pretty much was my role model, especially since I grew up without a father. He was the one who, in a certain sense, replaced and was my father, my spiritual father. After high school, I came to Chisinau. I studied for 4 years pastoral theology. During those years, it was when the desire and the idea to plant a new church in the city was born. And going several years ahead, in 2018, with a group of 7, we started a new church in one of the districts of Chisinau.
How big is Chisinau?
Well, currently, it would be about 50% of the population. And the population of the country is like 2.6 millions. So in the city and in the immediate suburbs, you'll have about 1 million people.
Oh, wow.
And it's growing. The city is growing fast as people from villages, especially younger people, are coming into the city.
So can I ask a question? I'm very curious about you coming across this seemingly random but God-placed Baptist church in this village. When I think of Moldova, I think of former Soviet Union and many years dominated by the Soviet Union and all that went into that. Where did this Baptist church come from? Is there a history of Baptist churches in Moldova, or was that a recently planted church? Was there missionary involvement in that? Where did this Baptist church come from? Do you know?
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. I actually, the history of Baptist churches and in general evangelistic, Protestant churches would be fairly short. I would say a little over 100 years. We find in history that one of the first Baptist missionaries in Moldova was John Onken. In 1800s, he came for some groups of Germanic groups in the southern part of Moldova. He was a Reformed Baptist, but then whatever he brought in was gone as those groups left Moldova. And in the beginning of 1900s, we had missionaries from Russia, Ukraine. But then you had the First World War, the Second World War, and especially under Stalin, you had the persecutions. So the gospel was present in those places, but it stayed very weak. It was in a very small presence, and it was a lot of persecution. Because of it, there was not much opportunities for those who were ministering to study, and therefore it was very shallow. Yeah, but especially after 1990s, when the Soviet Union system fell, a lot of missionaries were flooding Moldova, and all kinds of missionaries. Good ones and many not very good.
And others.
And others, yeah.
Good and other.
Good and others, yeah.
Hey, listeners, if you've been here for a while, you know our tagline already. Helping goers think and thinkers go. Well, we really mean that. Let me ask you, what are you going to do with everything that you're listening to right now on this show? And could it be that the Lord is leading you to join his mission and extend his kingdom among the nations in a new way? Remember that God doesn't call the equipped. He equips the called. He gets the most glory by using normal, weak, doubting people. Maybe you're ready to say what the prophet Isaiah said, "Here I am, Lord, send me." If you think missions, whether that's short-term or long-term, is in your future, we are here to partner with you and your church in the process of sending you. Our team wants to talk to you here at ABWE. We're a family of ministries extending across more than 80 nations of the globe, engaged in evangelism, discipleship, and church planting. Our team wants to talk to you. Go to abwe.org/send-me. Again, abwe.org/send-me, all one word. No guilt trips, no high-pressure sales tactics, just a friendly voice here to pray with you as you and your church discern your calling. So start the conversation now. abwe.org/send-me. Well, that leads into the next question. So the church today, what's the state of the church today? There's much more breadth even among that very slim minority of evangelicals and Protestants. What does that look like? What's the ecosystem of other churches and ministries around you? I'd imagine there's also, you're swimming in an ocean of nominal orthodoxy, secularism, etc.
Percentage wise, evangelicals will be between 1% and 2%. And the church, Baptist churches, Baptist Union will be the biggest denomination in Moldova. There's also Pentecostal Union. But there were some challenges that did not allow for the Baptist churches to grow in depth. Some of those challenges I see with pastors not being able to serve full time. One of the challenges, and this goes back to the Soviet Union. Like in Soviet Union times, if you are not working, this would be considered a crime. I'll put you in prison. Now, being a minister, that's not a job in any of the Soviet lists. So therefore, for 70 years, whoever was a minister, and of course, most ministers were under the KGB controls, and it was a strict kind of control of everything that was happening, were working. And this built the culture where ministers are ministering and working at the same time. Which did not allow for many, to go to a seminary or to go to a school to be better equipped. This creates a certain level of biblical illiteracy, theological shallowness, which therefore makes the churches in Moldova highly vulnerable to all kind of false teachings that are coming, especially now through social media, through YouTube, and the globalized church,
which I think is the polite way of saying exported from America.
Some of it,
we're
definitely,
sorry.
Yeah.
What kind of false teachings are you seeing that get exported?
Word of faith, definitely that. Especially, I think it exploded a lot during and after COVID. You see, it promises what Moldovans need and dream of: health. It's a big struggle. The medical system in Moldova is very poor. It's actually not uncommon for Moldovans, anytime they meet at a birthday, or one of the most common greetings that they have, or toasts when they raise the cup, they will say health. Health, because it's the precious of most of all. And this is because this has been a struggle. Now, you can see how word of faith, and health promised is gluing into that. And then poverty. Moldova is still considered to be the poorest country in Europe. That's creates a context where, but that's from the social kind of a context. But then when you have a very superficial grasp of the main doctrines of the Scripture, that's so word of faith. Lots of Jehovah's Witnesses. Lots of Jehovah's Witnesses, and their number actually is growing from Baptist and Pentecostal churches. A lot of Baptists, a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses whom I encounter in the streets, and I'll try to have conversations with them. I learned that they used to be members in Baptist churches, which is sad.
Scott, something that I think is interesting about this conversation, you and I are on opposite coasts. We're both shepherding congregations that are similar in size. Our brother Mihai here is also a world away, and yet your church would have how many roughly?
30 members.
30 members. Yeah. So we're all small church guys, and there's a beauty to that as well.
Absolutely.
And Scott, I know you've taken your church that you're currently pastoring through a little bit of a journey of figuring out, okay, what's next after seeker ministry, after attractional ministry, that movement, at least in the States, in some ways, I realize this isn't true across the board. Among a lot of people, it's sort of burned out, and people are seeking the next thing. You're taking your church through that journey. And that's something that I think you're walking through as well, right, Scott?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it makes sense. I mean, it's a very, it makes sense from just kind of a capitalistic understanding. Like we start things, we expect to see them grow at a certain rate of return, and hey, look, we can apply these methods of excellence to these things, and they should function well.
Very American.
Unfortunately, yeah, it's very, it's very American, but I think it's just kind of human nature too, in some degrees, but probably particularly American, or at least definitely Western. The problem is, like, the Bible doesn't give us that same pattern, and expects us to see growth through different ways, like evangelism and prayer and gospel fidelity and those kind of things. The things that we're called to, even in Scripture, and what pastors are called to be, are so countercultural. I think they're shockingly difficult when you start studying the pastoral epistles and what we're called to do and the kind of ministries we're called to have, because there's so much about Christian ethics and love and prayer, and as well as sound doctrine and sound teaching. So yeah, I think we have the same kind of struggles here that you probably would there, although we have different influences probably pushing us in those directions. I'm just curious, Mihai, as you are wrestling with that, what are some of the ways that you find your people, or maybe you see your sister churches kind of trying to wrestle with that? And what ways do you feel pulled?
Sadly, I don't see as much wrestle in the larger evangelical community I would like to in our country. It definitely creates pressure on our church because everybody is counting the success of the church numerically. And the question that you will get pretty much every time when you'll meet with other fellow pastors in the country will be, well, how many are you and how have you grown? So for us, it is by teaching the church again and again that the numerical growth of the church is not on us, and we cannot manipulate it, and we have to have a clarity as what are we called to, and it's to be faithful to proclaiming the whole gospel. And actually, most of the people who are part of our church join from other churches, and one of the biggest learning curve for most of them was to actually get a better grip of the gospel. Very shocking how often you will encounter people who have been in church for 5 years, 10 years, and yet they have a very difficult time articulating the gospel. So as a church, we made it a priority that we want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding as what the gospel is, and then what evangelism is. Evangelism is not putting on a show and making sure that we are as attractive as possible to the community. And it's not just giving food packages and keeping a high attendance on food packages, which is possible. And you can have definitely a very large church if you provide systematic humanitarian aid. And I can see some of that around us, sadly. By teaching that again and again, that's how we try to fight with some of that pressure, and by reminding people that our calling is to be faithful in evangelism as the Bible teaches us, and not as perhaps, I don't know, Rick Warren or others teach us.
And that's interesting, because I would never think, what are some of the major challenges of pastoring a church that's Baptistic, that's more reformed in Moldova. I would never think, oh, well, obviously it's, that's the place where the seeker sensitive paradigm would reign. Wouldn't cross my mind. I would think of other difficulties, for instance, with Eastern Orthodoxy. At least in Russia, there's been this resurgence of Orthodoxy as a part of the national identity.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's been a barrier for you, and I wonder what other barriers or obstacles you've faced pastoring as a part of the theological tradition to which we all belong.
On some similarities to what happened in Russia, some years ago, the Orthodox Church in Moldova, they opened this mission department, which is interesting that the whole purpose of the mission department is fighting Baptist churches, and other evangelical churches. It's not so much about
we are the worst.
Yeah. Well, for them, usually an Eastern Orthodox, when he thinks whatever is not Eastern Orthodox is the same. The same garbage bin for them, theological garbage bin, because for them this is
you might as well
sect.
be a pagan.
Yeah, it's a sect.
Interesting.
Well, first of all, you are seen as a traitor if you come from Eastern Orthodox family. If you're now a Baptist, you're a traitor, and you will be despised. Eastern Orthodoxy emphasizes a lot the deeds, and there is a lot of show religion, facade religion. It's not. It's so much embedded in culture. Just to illustrate it, I was growing up in my grandma's place, and they will fight, and have this argument and use these bad words. And my grandma is like, "Shh, today is a holiday. Let's not use cursing words because it's a holiday." So it's almost like God has a specially developed ear, in the holidays, and his hearing is not so good in the other days, where you behave in a certain way when you are nearby an Orthodox building, and it's so much about place and certain seasons, and I think some of that did influence a little bit of the evangelical communities and some of the Baptist churches, where
the formalism,
worship is where I go, to church, but how I live, it does not affect further my day-to-day life. I can still be corrupt, in my dealings with the authorities or in my dealings with others. I can, still be, and it not that it's encouraged from the pulpits, but I think that's so much
it's
ingrained, in people's mindset that it.
So follow-up question to that. In my experience, so when I was a part of a seeker-driven church, we're in a area that's there's a lot of Roman Catholics in our county. Part of the appeal of the attractional model was it's so dressed down compared to formalized emphasis on the exterior, right? Forms of religion. And so the practitioners of that model felt as though they could appeal to somebody on that basis, right?
Yeah.
This isn't your grandma's church sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is that part of the appeal of those in Moldova who've taken that seeker-sensitive approach, is to say, well, because there's so much formalism, we're going to subvert that with this very entertainment-driven, we would say shallow, but certainly more informal style of Christianity. Is that part of their thinking?
Yeah, I think that's definitely winning a lot of young people, where it's all about feelings and
it's
so
like
much
opposite extremes, like from all formality to like zero formality at all. And you're sort of saying like, well, but we also have a rich heritage and a faith that's been once for all delivered to the saints. There is some formality that matters here, right?
Yeah, and for like with some churches which are basically some U.S. franchises, exported and functioning very much as a franchise.
McChurch.
Those are very appealing to young people, but we've already, in a very brief time, have seen a very quick rise, and just as quick it was, so it went down, with the big heresies, and when only thing that is emphasized is the stage and the performance, and that's definitely appealing, to younger generation. Some of the older generation, for them, church is reverence, and I think this is where Eastern Orthodox, when you enter one of the Eastern Orthodox church buildings, you feel very small, and it gives you this sense of awe, and that's what some Baptist churches have taking it to an too far opposite side, where there is no sense of reverence, no sense of awe at all.
Yeah.
And that's what will keep away some of the older generation, because they'll say, well, this is just a nightclub.
Yeah.
It's not a church.
Yeah.
Young people will definitely go into it, because for them, this is the postmodern generation where whatever our parents were, we're not. We're going exactly on the opposite side of that.
Which is interesting, because in the U.S. we're on the tail end of that movement, where it was. And Scott, you can speak to this too.
Sure.
It's even a generational thing. Like the Gen X, the Boomers were the ones that were very much about that entertainment driven style of ministry. It's us, the millennials, who are like, actually, give me some smells and bells, give me some reverence, because I want to feel a little bit more rooted. And it doesn't seem like you guys have quite achieved the tail end of that cycle quite yet. Scott, do you want to cut in with a question?
I agree with everything you're saying there, Alex. It's like almost like we feel like we've come through that consumer driven model, and while it's still there and it's still thriving in some ways, there's a weariness of it, and I think a backlash to that says, hey, let's get back to something more serious. So as you're dealing with that, what are the connections like? I think of, I'm part of a group of Baptist churches locally. I'm part of associations of churches here, and we have our squabbles and things that we're fighting about and wrestling through. What are the associations like in Moldova, and what are some of the doctrinal battles you guys are continuing to just wrestle through, you think?
You're getting my toes into fire now. In terms of Baptist churches, we have one major, kind of association, which is a Baptist Union. There will be a few smaller associations of Baptist churches, but this is the major and the largest, actually, church association. It's a union. Functions in terms of polity, it's closer to the Presbyterian model of how it functions.
Okay.
Now, theologically, the Baptist Union would be kind of quasi-Armenian, semi-Pelagian, and that's it's very interesting, because when you go in 1920s, both in Romania, of which Moldova was a part several times, and then of Soviet Union, there was clear in the statement of faith, a clear understanding of the eternal security. Now that has been lost. Some people are saying that has been lost in especially in the Soviet parts with the mix that Stalin made, because Stalin would not allow, for like X number of unions or denominations. And there was a time when one of the largest Baptist church in Chisinau, you had Brethrens, and you had Baptists, and you had Pentecostals. And another thing, some of the brightest minds of the ministers, some of the leaders, who could articulate some theology were taken up in Siberia. And then you had some leaders, for Mennonites, in the leadership of the Baptist Union. So that's where, for example, the eternal security, I think, was lost. So by default, most in Moldova would believe strongly, that you can lose your salvation. That affects a lot discipleship. That affects a lot, I would say, even how evangelism looks like, because it's pretty much you have to decide. And you have, that's why we have so much,
very revivalistic.
Revivalist, exactly. Raise your hand, repeat this prayer, come in front, and if you do this, and then that affects, even people's sense of security, and then it leads to the joy and peace that they experience. So I think for us as a church now, we are kind of an independent church. We're not part of any unions, and part of it is because we are on a more reformed theological page, and that puts us at odds with the larger evangelical community where we are in. And some of the biggest challenges actually that we had to face were not from the Eastern Orthodox Church, but was from the Baptist churches.
Fire.
Yeah, where labels and accusations and red flags that we are importing, and we're bringing this, heretical and very dangerous teaching. And that's I mean, some Baptist churches would rather partner with Pentecostals, and then with those who embrace doctrines of grace, or some other, reform.
Do they not see the connection between weaker doctrinal teaching and why the cults are? You talked a little bit before about like Jehovah's Witnesses being so prominent. I see a direct connection between really bad theology and lack of theological grounding, and kind of a biblicism where it's like all we need is the Bible. We don't need any theology or any kind of understanding of deeper, some of these deeper things and how they fit together, and the rise of those cults. Do they not see that connection at all?
I wish they would.
I love your optimism.
Yeah.
I wish they would. Definitely, there are some who are seeing, and I'm actually very encouraged, to see kind of a revival among some ministers, where it's definitely God's work in their hearts, where they ask bolder questions, and some of the work that we are doing there on the ground and trying to equip some of the ministers. The fellowship we have seems to be growing, and it's happening on a more local level, not as much on a systematical level. And some of that biblicism is actually embraced very strongly because of very much of a pietistic mindset, and that glues again very much with Eastern Orthodoxy compared to Catholicism. Eastern Orthodox is very, very, very mystical, where Catholicism would be somewhat more scholastic. And that mysticism and that it's all about the importance is to be sincere. It has to come from the heart. Well, you hear a lot of that from the pulpits, where it's about sincerity. It's about being honest, and serious doctrine was not taught for most of those who are in pulpit. For many of them, and they therefore they have a hard time understanding, the importance of that, and creating opportunities for believers to learn.
All of our churches, in which each one of the three of us have served, have been through some kind of a theological journey of teaching the sheep, such things as the doctrines of grace. And it does seem to me. And I know we have listeners from various theological persuasions, but it does seem to me that there is a fear of these doctrines among those who don't have yet to embrace them, which is always funny to me. It seems to me that if I've got my hand on the controls of my decisionism, my revivalism, my methods that I'm using in evangelism, the idea, telling people that they can't lose their salvation, that the saints will persevere. That's a little scary. That means I have to let my hand off the control. And yet, and maybe it's just because I've been outside of battling this issue for so long. Can you not see the beauty of it? But God's hands are on the control. Like that's the beauty of it is that He will keep the people. Is that the pressure isn't on you. You just get to preach the word and watch Him work sovereignly. And so, it always seems that there's an aversion to people like Mihai. Not so much the other way around. It seems to me that very often it's like, no, I understand where you're coming from. You want to maintain. Yes, you have to choose to follow the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. That's necessary that you would choose to follow Him. But also crediting God with bringing the increase. Let me ask you a slightly different question, though, because you mentioned orthodoxy again. And I just want to zoom out a little bit, though. So in the broader cultural context, as you're seeking to make disciples, because we know that part of holding the doctrines of grace is, yes, we're going to proclaim a gospel of grace. We're not just going to sit and, wait for God to work apart from human instrumentality. Would you say that similar to, I have several Roman Catholic friends who they're wrong. I've told them they're wrong. I also think that some of them are regenerate despite certain errors that I think the Roman Catholic version of the gospel is guilty of. I think that they're regenerate despite the Roman Catholic Church, not because of it too. That's a distinction that I want to make. Do you know Orthodox people that you would put into a similar category? Are there sincere Orthodox believers who maybe they've got the wrong categories. Maybe they're not thinking about justification, but there's some level of a saving faith in them? Or would you say that Orthodoxy is a lot further from the biblical gospel than even the Roman Catholic view, we would say?
I definitely know a few. I wish I know more, but a few people, like you say, some of your friends that you have, and there seems to be a resurgence of preaching in the Orthodox Church. A classic or Eastern Orthodox liturgy is very much about chanting, singing, and actually there were long periods where even priests or bubble because they didn't know for example some of the language that the liturgy will be led. But now for the last at least decade since God saved me.
I gotta run that back. The priests would do what? You said bubble?
Yeah, they would have to pronounce some of the parts of the liturgies would have to be to mumble to. They'll have sorry, they would have to pronounce it in a certain language and that they would not know.
Yes.
And now it seems that this is changing. At least I see more priests preaching and emphasizing preaching. I've seen, I
see them in my Instagram feed.
Yeah.
And my YouTube feed, like reels of Orthodox priests preaching hot gospel.
Yeah. And
that's what's happening. That's a new phenomenon.
Yeah. That seems to be changing. And I think this is where Eastern Orthodox Church might gain more people, and some, from evangelical circles, might choose to go there because sometimes, you'll have some of them preaching and yet, you have a more kind of a reverent, liturgy.
Yeah, sure.
Where in some, Baptist churches, there is little preaching. It's more like a TED talk and it's a concert show. And for an Orthodox, that's well, if I got to choose, that's rather what I would go with. So I knew some people, and I had a friend actually in high school, and he was firm Orthodox. And I had another friend who was Baptist, and there was another classmate we had. She was Pentecostal. With the Orthodox, I had the most in-depth conversations about God. And
I'll take that over the squishy, soft evangelfish.
Yeah,
which I know is hard pill to swallow, but
well, what's interesting is we do see in America quite a few. I mean, there's certain trends of evangelicals going into Orthodoxy, just like they're going into Catholicism and into Anglicanism. Well, I mean, Anglicanism is a totally different category, I would say, but like looking into those more liturgical forms of worship because of some of the vapidness they're finding in some of the evangelical traditions they grew up in.
Which I think you're almost in a position of saying, as I've sort of said to others, it's like, hey, you don't, in the case of converting to Roman Catholicism, you don't have to swim the Tiber.
Yeah.
Or in this case, the Danube, I don't know, whatever the analogy is, you don't have to go to the East.
Yeah.
I mean, you can find the reverence.
Yeah.
Within the Protestant confessional tradition. There's more than just modern evangelicalism with its emphasis on entertainment and growth. There's also a rich tradition of like, we hold all of the ecumenical creeds.
Yeah.
We have 17th century, confessional documents that are robust and stand the test of time. We have the modern missions movement, launched by Baptists that held to those distinctives and held to the doctrines of grace. You don't have to go to these other movements that maybe have the reverence going for them.
Yeah.
But they're lacking on certain fundamental tenets of justification. You can find those things and still hold to what it takes to enter the kingdom, right? Well, which is it's great news, honestly, for a generation.
That would be the case, if people would be aware of the church history. With perhaps shame, I have to admit, as a church, we were probably the first confessional church in our country. And I came to learn about the 1689 confession to which our church upholds.
At least since the missionaries Because you said some of the first missionaries were Reformed Baptists who came.
Yeah, the first, but that seed was for some reason not left for long.
Right.
The missions happened more among the Germanic communities, and those communities left then, and whatever the work was done was left with them. So, in our case, I learned about some of the historical confessions, and the the regular principle of worship, and how worship was in some of the churches in 17th century, way after seminary, and most are not studying that in seminary. And because I think a lot of it is because many of our people don't know church history and don't know for example, Baptist churches were upholding, back in 17th century, or, what they believed and how they lived, and how important was church membership, which is a huge crisis in our country, huge crisis. It's only on paper and in theory. Being a member, it means I'm somewhere in the list, but I pick and choose where I go on Sundays. So if people would study a little bit more, would be exposed to some of the historical roots of at least their labels, perhaps that will help a little bit.
Let me take us in for a landing, and we will pivot to our overtime show and talk more about how ministry for you, maybe it hasn't changed, maybe it's changed radically. Lots of refugees coming from Ukraine, and the way that the conflict affects the whole region, I think, is important to think through, even with the humanitarian aid. And is that a bad church growth tool? I think there's a really big question there that we have to be willing to stare in the face. We'll do that in the overtime show, but would you please just any final encouragements for maybe American listeners listening, and what are some lessons that we could take away from what you're seeing from your perspective? I think we've already touched on some of that, and then please let people know how they can also learn more about you and support your work.
I would like to encourage the churches by saying that I started when we were thinking about church planting. I was all into Stephen Hurtick, Brian Houston, and super mega, seeker sensitive stuff. I was helped and straightened out. Some of the bad influence came from the States, but the help also came from here. So how I got, connected with ABWE was through some, missionaries who were visiting, and when they learn about my ideas of church planting, they will start sending me some articles, from 9 Marks, and that helped me a lot. There are still a good number of healthy churches, and a big number, probably more than in any other parts of the world here in the States. And I'm encouraged by this, and this had helped us, and we were straightened up because of the help that we received from here, from some good churches. And I pray that God will expand the influence and impact and model of those healthy churches, just those where you are ministering, Brother Scott, and that in spite of a lot of not so good theology and not so good model, this will be propagated more. Praying for us, please, that God will help us to persevere in spite of all the hostilities that we may face, some internal challenges and some external challenges. We are, in certain sense, we are pioneering on certain fields in our country, and it's very easy to grow arrogant, perhaps, or proud about that God will keep us humble, and that God will help us to be faithful.
You pray that He will.
Yes, yes, and that He will keep us faithful, because there are challenges that we face on the ground. And in our Live Global page, if you type in Imago Dei Ministries, you can learn more about us and about some of the work that we are doing for outreach, and some of the work that we're doing to equip other churches. We're trying to do a lot of that because we've been blessed by some good, healthy churches from here, and we want to be a mean of blessing farther down to other people who perhaps didn't have the opportunity to be in touch, with some people like we did. So I pray that God will raise many more faithful ministers in Moldova, and we will see many more healthy churches across the nation.
Amen. Yes. And still kind of a newer church plant. And so, we'll include that link in the show notes. You can also just go to liveglobal.org, look up Imago Dei Church, Imago Dei Moldova, and you'll find that page. You can pray, you can watch a video, more explanation about your ministry there. You can give. And if the Lord would put that on your heart to bless the ministry, you're welcome to do so. We'll pick up this conversation for our premium subscribers in the overtime. Until then, for the rest of our listeners, thank you for joining us on the Missions Podcast. This is a ministry of ABWE. To get more information about ABWE, maybe take your own next step in the Great Commission, go to abwe.org. And before you leave, make sure you leave us a positive rating or review in your podcast platform of choice. That does help other people be able to discover the content. To join that premium club so that you can stay with us for the next conversation, you can go to missionspodcast.com to get more content, and then hit the premium tab up at the top to join the family. Until our next episode, go make disciples of all nations. Take care.